Hello there. Just listening to the sound of church bells from the estate. Generations of Fairfax Aches have been buried in the cemetery and churchyard over there. Some of them were lucky enough to be dead when it happened. Well, it's been a number of weeks since I made my last video, and so much again has happened within British society and British politics. It really is quite hard to keep up sometimes. However, let's give it a try. First off was the unfortunate passing of the Queen just after Liz Truss found herself appointed leader of the Conservative Party and therefore Prime Minister. It's a sad event by any reckoning, because the Queen herself had been the longest reigning British monarch. And I believe her passing acts as another waymarker in this country's transition from the last remnants of empire into its current situation. I also believe that although she has herself acted as a standard and a constant over the last 70 years, it may have, as others have written, blinded us somewhat in this country to some conversations we really ought to have been having that we have not had. One of those conversations would obviously be the continuing role of a monarchy in the polity of the United Kingdom. I'm no monarchist. I certainly believe that a conversation about the new king as head of state and his inheritors from there should take place. There are an awful lot of contradictions in having an unelected hereditary monarch acting as a head of state, even as largely disempowered as the British monarch actually is. However, I'm also not sufficiently Republican to believe that this is a conversation that needs to be had within the immediate future. We have far too many pressing issues right now, and certainly the idea of trying to disentangle, for example, the monarchy from British public life, particularly when Henry VIII managed to make sure that the ruler is in fact also the head of the national church, could be rather intensive. For the moment, it can be let lie, but as I say, I believe it's a conversation this country should be having within the reign of King Charles III. Moving on, however, it only took 3 weeks for new PM Liz Truss and her Chancellor Kamikwazi to really show how badly run this country is being under the current Conservative Party. From a supposed mini-budget, which was anything but, market confusion reigned shortly after he gave his speech on the 23rd of September in Parliament. The wide and large-scale subsidies towards people's energy bills had been flagged up early on. It was totally necessary. Quite simply, the continued rising of the energy cap prices could not be sustained by anybody. The prices being discussed would be such that people normally with no great consideration for their energy bills would be looking aghast and wondering where they were going to find the money, let alone those people who at the lower end of the salary scales were finding already that a doubling of energy prices had put them under considerable pressure. The pound tanked almost immediately. Unfortunately, Kamikwazi then promptly offered further tax cuts in interviews on the Sunday. By the time the Asian markets opened on Monday, the pound had fallen to its lowest ever rate against the US dollar, although it did rally ever so slightly. Things didn't stop there, of course. Unfortunately, again, the Bank of England, having initially committed itself to a policy of quantitative tightening, i.e. offering up more bonds for sale, then had to carry out its process of quantitative easing again. The problem was that an awful lot of UK pension funds hold a lot of their values in UK gilts, government bonds. What had happened was that confidence in the UK economy as a whole had dropped so much that gilts were suddenly expected to pay more interest and were being sold off at a tremendous rate. Several UK pension funds suddenly found themselves, if not within touching distance, then certainly within sight of insolvency, because the bonds they were holding were of such a little value that they could not cover their commitments. The Bank of England stepped in, promising up to £65 billion worth of support by buying back UK debt over a number of days. This did seem to steady things out somewhat, but nevertheless, as far as the markets were concerned, the international reputation of the United Kingdom was even further trashed than it already had been. What's quite remarkable is the sudden plummet in the Tories' popularity as well. From being unpopular, but only hovering a few points below the Labour Party, they've suddenly plunged away as the Labour Party stock, after a very successful conference, has risen. It now seems that the Labour Party has overtaken, by some considerable margin, the economic competence, or at least the public's belief in their economic competence, of the Conservative Party. They have thoroughly shot themselves in the foot. Already revolution is being talked about. Is it possible to get rid of Truss? Is it possible, if Truss has to stay, that Kwarteng himself could be forced out? One of the many things about the two heads of the UK government, Truss and Kwarteng, is that they are both claimed to be intelligent, but those people that know them have quietly reported that there is an awful lot of arrogance associated with them. Kwarteng particularly is not noted for being a great believer in wanting to listen to anybody else's opinions other than his own. Indeed, the whole Tory cabinet seems to have been invaded, quite deliberately of course, by members of the far-right think tanks that populate Tufton Street in London. These think tanks basically believe in the entirety of free markets, the slashing of welfare, the minimising of the state, all for the so-called goal of economic growth. Unfortunately, as far as these think tanks go, there is not a shred of evidence that cutting taxes for the wealthy, which is what has happened in the budget, cutting the size of the welfare state, cutting the size of the state generally, tinkering around with stamp duty on house prices of absurd values if you're a first-time buyer, actually promotes growth. There is an elephant in the room here. Well, actually, there's two. I'll discuss those in the conclusion. But quite simply, the Tories under Truss and Kwarteng have committed themselves to 2.5% GDP growth over the next couple of years. There's zero evidence that any of these neoliberal policies have ever created that. Plus, of course, the budget itself was completely iniquitous as far as tax was concerned. Although a basic rate tax cut to 19% was announced, benefiting the poorer paid people of society, but also benefiting those much further up the scale, the announcement of the abolition of the top rate of tax, already a fairly measly 45%, was also announced. Ultimately, with the run on the pound, the likelihood that the Bank of England will have to raise interest rates because what the government is doing is counter to what the Bank of England is doing, which is trying to control inflation, may well mean that any benefits for the lower paid sections of the UK will be rapidly eaten up and outweighed by rises in mortgage and borrowing rates. All in all, this budget has been a total disaster. Tory MPs are already talking about trying to do away with Liz. already talk of significant rebellions, if not over the whole package, then at least of alliances with the Labour Party to ensure that various parts of it, such as, for example, the top rate tax cuts, will not go forward. Even many Conservative MPs have suddenly realised that the public will not buy into borrowing at such a vast rate to fund tax cuts for the rich, at the same time as welfare benefits and public services are being cut. It seems quite incredible that they've not fulfilled and not seen this until now, but nevertheless it seems to be happening. There's strong talk of revolt for the Truss government and danger for her in that she may end up being as much of a lame duck as Theresa May was in her premiership. Certainly it seems, 2 years is a long time of course, but certainly it seems as though she has lost the next election within the first 3 weeks of becoming Prime Minister. But that election, as I just noted, is 2 years away. Things may change. But the Labour Party have had a very successful conference. The antagonistic left largely suppressed. You know, the antagonistic left, the ones that seem to want to believe in ideological purity before they get elected, rather than acknowledging that the only way to influence things is to get elected and get into power. Although it's not a commitment by the leadership of the Labour Party yet, there was an overwhelming vote at the conference for proportional representation, which gives hope that perhaps this long string of the Tories believing they are a government by default may come to an end. With proportional representation, you do have to be careful what you wish for, however, and as some have said, it might allow a foothold for even more right-wing extremist groups to actually get into Parliament. But that may well be a risk that you'd have to accept, since you can't really say that the Tories are not particularly right-wing currently. We've effectively got a very hard right government, which has followed hard right governments since the coup after Brexit. This brings me to the conclusion. As I said, there are two elephants in the room. Kamikwazi's budget was supposed to promote growth, with the budget aiming to provide 2.5% over the next 2 years. Unfortunately, the far right of the Tory party's own Brexit, their hard Brexit that they campaigned so long for, once that very, very simplistic yes-no vote was narrowly awarded to the yes, leave EU faction, took place. It's already been calculated by proper experts that the exit of the United Kingdom from the European Union is costing the economy anywhere between 4 and 5.5% of GDP already. That's elephant one. Quite simply, if you pursue the Brexit you have done, you will lower the UK's GDP. The second elephant in the room is one that may be more long-term, but I believe people are becoming more and more aware of this as things go by. Unfortunately, any push for further growth needs to be very, very green. Quite simply, growth at current business as usual ways is going to increase, not decrease, our environmental problems, because it will require more energy, it will require more fossil fuels, and it will require much more consumption of stuff. If there's going to be growth, it really must be as part of, as is already being mentioned, and the phrase does the rounds every so often in both the UK and the US, a Green New Deal. Any growth has to be assessed from the point of view of its green credentials. That doesn't mean it's impossible, although there are people that will tell you that growth in any shape or form is rather more than the globe can afford. We already consume more resources than are able to be replenished as a race on this planet. This second elephant is, as I said, rather more long term, but unfortunately the government's policy already of restarting fracking, granting fresh new licenses to oil and gas developers in the North Sea, is not going to do anything to solve the country's energy problems in the short term either. None of those projects are likely to come on stream for perhaps 10 years. And indeed, the former heads of Codrilla, the fracking company, initially granted a licence for Preston North End in Lancashire, in a column in the Guardian newspaper, basically admitted that no amount of fracking in this country is going to make the slightest bit of difference, since unlike those shale deposits in the United States, which are productive, though at ecological cost, the deposits in this country are much, much harder to mine and potentially could do more damage. It should be pointed out that that column more or less gaslighted the entire UK population and their suspicion about fracking, but nonetheless, coming from, as I say, former heads of Codrilla, that's quite an overwhelming assessment. If you knock out Elephant 2, for the moment, Elephant 1, the simple fact that leaving the EU has already damaged our GDP to the tune of between 4 and 5.5% per annum, means that any incoming government has got to rapidly reset our relationship with the European Union. At the moment, the Labour Party basically is acting as though rejoining and close association with the European Union is the act that cannot state its name. My personal belief is, in the short term, rejoining is out of the question. If nothing else, I think the European Union would think twice about letting us accede. And one of the biggest problems there is that we had the best deal we could have with the European Union, with so many opt-outs, so many money-back deals, that we will not be able to negotiate the same again. We will be joining the European Union on much the same terms as all the other more recent joiners. This in itself is significant harm to the United Kingdom's interest, but nevertheless, perhaps rejoining simply the customs union and stating our intention to fully align with EU in phytosanitary and environmental regulations, for example, would at least help us to repair and rebuild our lost trade with our continental neighbours. It won't happen under a Conservative Party. They are quite simply too ideologically ingrained and under the thumb of their far-right factions to even remotely consider this. They have got to go. Perhaps it might happen. Perhaps a vote of confidence might be forced sometime over the next few months if the Truss-Kwarteng alliance proves to be as calamitous as it already has. But if not, hopefully the Labour Party can inherit an economy that's not too trashed in a couple of years' time, and there may be some progress made from there. Anyhow, chin chin.